All right, we are now recording. This is MS Office Hours, and today is, let's see, it is Thursday, September the 12th, 2019, and we are talking about zero trust in education. This is kind of an early talk track around this, and I'd love to have your guys' feedback. What we find out is when we go out and talk to anyone around cybersecurity, one of the most common things that comes up is a conversation around a zero trust model or a zero trust architecture. And so what we wanted to do is to try to translate that specifically to education. Microsoft, for a few years now, has actually been building some very elaborate zero trust tools and conversations around how to utilize the Microsoft 365 stack to implement zero trust. A big focus of that as we go through it, as you'll see, will be through using Azure Active Directory and Windows Defender and some other tools to really make this work well for you. The great news is you can get started down this path with Microsoft 365 A3 or A5 in particular. But before we go any further down that whole track, let's talk about what the heck is this zero trust that I keep talking about, and why should you care? So what we really want to do is talk about how we're going to keep whatever our assets are away from the attackers, as it says here. Now, the real key to zero trust is this idea of what if everything was exposed? What if we truly assume breach? We've been talking about that term for a long time, of assume breach. Let's assume that everybody has access to it. Now this term breach has become scary. So there's I have a compromised accounts, but breach means I have to report something. So I think we just needed a new term for it. But really what this is we're going to essentially assume that everyone has access to whatever credentials, device, network that we have, and how do we then reduce the impact? So when we talk about that, here's kind of what we look at, right? There are lots of things that you guys have to do and manage. In fact, as I was preparing to go through some of the documentation I'm now building to give you guys detailed guidance on sort of how to get started in building out zero trust over the course of even a year or more, I realized that it can be super overwhelming to try to figure out what all is included in your Microsoft 365 licenses. Which document should I go look at to determine which thing to deploy and in what order, and how does one policy impact another, all those types of things. And so when we layer on top of that, that we have a nearly infinite number of devices and users and apps and networks that are all sort of competing for all of our users' time and attention, and it creates all this stuff, there is just a tremendous amount of complexity. And from a security standpoint, complexity is the opposite of security. It literally sort of lived inside of our trusted network in our premises within our boundaries. And this is a lot of times the castle and moat that we talk about, right? So where we really talk about using perimeter based security to stop attacks, to say everything's inside these walls, so as long as I can keep the bad guys out and keep the good things in, we're all fine. It's fairly simple. I've got a general idea of it. However, that just really hasn't worked out for us, because the attackers have shifted from trying to penetrate through a firewall and all that to instead really taking control of your identity. And this is really what we see in phishing attacks, right? As you guys have all heard me talk about before, phishing is not a email attack. It just isn't. They use email as one of many modes by which they're going to try to obtain end users' credentials. And so what we're seeing in education right now, both K-12 and higher, is probably, this is a subjective viewpoint from what I can see and talking to all of you outside of this call, is that we're probably seeing more attacks this year than we ever have in the past. And that's consistent. We see that rise year over year. The problem is now they're being more and more successful with it. So what we want to do with zero trust is really talk about what are we going to do about the fact that we don't even have control over most of the devices that are accessing our content. We can choose to not allow them on our network, but that doesn't really solve our problem, because much of the content that's being created is created in cloud platforms like Office 365 or G Suite. And worse yet, if we lock those down too tightly, people just very quickly pivot to using consumer grade technology from Microsoft, Google, Dropbox, Box, any of these different companies, right? And that doesn't even count what all's on their mobile devices and those things, which can be lost or stolen. So we have to talk about how can we actually secure and deal with all of these new sort of complexities, as I call them. So what is zero trust, and what are 3 steps to zero trust? I like this because it's super, super simple. The first thing to realize, or the third thing, and we'll count down, I guess, thing 3, if you will, is that identity is the control plane. So this is really the idea of, instead of trying to control everything at a perimeter-based network, instead what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, listen, we can control access to applications, networks, and devices based on identity, right? So if we can use identity to provision and deprovision, we can use identity to control access or to block access, right? Now we're getting into a whole new realm of possibility, right? The second thing then is assume that every resource is on the open internet. This is the easiest way to think about it. And as we talked in just a little bit about how Microsoft is working to implement zero trust, this will come up again, right? So in our own organization, that's really what we're talking about is we'll just talk about it right now. Microsoft in general, and you can go online and get detailed documentation on what we're doing and what our journey looks like. But essentially, we're making the assumption that just like I am here today, I have 2 different devices running. One is my personal device, one is a company device. They can both access the exact same information. They're both connected to my personal internet connection. Who knows what shape that firewall is in? Microsoft certainly doesn't. So how do they provide secure access to all of this, assuming all of these things are already exposed to the internet? And finally, the way that we're able to do that and the way we implement that is to just assume that every time you go to access something, we need to once again verify that you are safe and secure. And so let's talk about how we would actually do that. We do that with an access control strategy, which we call conditional access. And we're going to get into more detail about that. I should finish that conversation around what Microsoft's doing. One of the most interesting things about how we are accomplishing what I just described is, like at Microsoft offices, we are working to make it so that the only internet connection is the commodity internet. So when I go there, even with my corporate device, I'm going to connect to the commodity internet service, no different than you as a guest who would come to visit there. And so that's the type of thing that we're doing to help build this all down. Now, what does that mean? How does this all really work and look? And if you think about it like this, if you've done any programming in your lifetime, this would be a common thread, right? We have an input, we have some kind of computation, and then we have output. And it's the same basic thing with what we're doing here. We're saying there's all kinds of signaling that comes into this evaluation environment, right? So we want as many different types of signals as we can possibly get. And then we're going to take and we're going to evaluate those signals, right? And from there, make a decision. And as a result of that decision, some policy will be enforced. And so one of the keys to making this work well, and that really allows Microsoft and other identity-based providers to implement an impressive zero trust model, is that we're able to, reevaluate our decisions throughout the session itself. And we can have different policies enforced on different types of assets. So on devices or SaaS applications, or even individual SaaS platforms can have different policies attached to them. And so that's really kind of the key of what we're trying to do. Again, we're going to look at the signals. We're going to make some evaluation based on those signals, right? And sort of compared to whatever your request was, right? And then we're going to enforce some policy in part based upon what that request was. So let's look at how this sort of works. There are really 2 different paradigms for a zero trust network. Man, time was good. Okay, so the first one is network based. The one that we've been talking about is identity based. So let's just compare them for a minute to really just sort of lay it out and say why we feel like identity based is the right way to go. Number one, because most of you guys have Microsoft 365 platform, and so as a result can already get started with identity based without any additional significant investments. That's where we want to look. But more importantly, just from a architectural standpoint, sort of our issue is that we still are on a similar playing field from depending on the different type of vendor that you have. So maybe, for instance, you're setting on a network that's built up by Cisco, and they're very much looking at network connections to apply their zero trust versus Microsoft. So in essence, what we look at is from a network standpoint, you're focused on microsegmentation, which isn't a bad thing by any means. Essentially saying that I'm going to assume that once you get a hold of any one device, you could easily move laterally to other devices. Therefore, what I'm going to do from a network standpoint is segment that network down as small as I can, so that if you get a hold of a particular device, you can't move from one device to the next, because I've got network layer security in there to prevent that. And so in many cases, you're limiting that all the way down to an IP, right? I know I'm oversimplifying, but we do that for sake of time as much as anything. On an identity standpoint, we're kind of taking a different approach to it, where we're saying we have to establish some kind of a trust. So there's general authentication, but what we're saying is trust is defined by authentication and authorization. So the cool thing about this is the two coexist. They don't have to be completely separate. And we'll talk about that more in a second. But essentially what we're looking at from scope and applicability is on the network version, we have it's a little bit limited at that time because it only allows you to control the networks that you are in charge of. So it struggles to be able to handle SaaS and PaaS environments. There are some interesting things that happen from proxies and that type of standpoint. From an identity standpoint, we natively protect all the modern cloud assets, not just Microsoft, but through the Azure Active Directory SSO environment, those types of things, even the SCIM 2.0 provisioning processes that are in place. We can control a lot of this in the cloud. We can also protect your legacy intranet assets via proxy. So you guys have seen me a lot of times talk about using remote app proxying things and publishing your endpoints into Azure AD so that we can protect those even though they're in the on-prem environment. That's exactly how Microsoft is implementing the network changes I mentioned before. So the real differentiation here is around the amount of threat intelligence and signaling that we get. You remember in the previous slide, I was showing you that signals are the rich information that we're using to evaluate the request that you've placed, right? To determine what kind of access we should grant you. So the richer the signal intelligence, the more intelligent the decision could be. And in particular, the thing that I find most interesting in this is the UEBA. And you've probably heard me talk about this a lot lately, which is user entity behavioral analysis. So that behavioral analytics piece is what allows us to go in and essentially model the behavior of users and devices and all of those types of things, and then ultimately apply AI or machine learning across these massive data sets every time an anomaly occurs within that UEBA model, right? So when an anomaly occurs, I use these new models to say, hey, how does this compare to all the known things that happen? So for instance, if you're setting on Microsoft 365 A3, you have this thing called ATA, or Advanced Threat Analytics, that allows you to install some VMs, and it will monitor your on-prem network to look for any existing bad actors. And the way that it does that is by looking for anything that is past the hash, golden ticket, all these sort of known attacks. And through that machine learning and UEBA, we can essentially eliminate false positives. And so what we look at is when we start stepping into things like A5, and I can give you guys some more information on this if you want, where you can start to see how all these pieces really play together from Azure ATP, which is the big brother to the ATA, which is the A5 piece of it, how that can connect all the way up to things like Defender ATP and Microsoft Cloud App Security and all these pieces, so that they can make intelligent real-time decisions based upon that. So essentially what we're talking about is what I described before. We have richer signaling, gives us better decision-making capabilities that result in rapid and more granular control sets in the enforcement of policies. So here's the way we recommend it. I mentioned before that they can sort of coexist, and I think this is the best way to look at this. So align segmentation strategy and teams, right? So essentially what we're saying is start to pull all these things together so that we can start to have a single identity. It's the idea of a hybrid identity, starting to tie Azure Active Directory into your cloud-based solutions as you have Active Directory in your on-prem, then starting to use Azure Active Directory to protect your on-prem web endpoints, those types of things, right? Same thing with apps and all these different things. Then we use that to build all of this identity-based perimeter. And then ultimately what we want to do is use microsegmentation to take care of any of that residual risk that may still exist. So between your server environments, on-prem, those types of things, even in your Azure world. So when we talk about all this rich signaling that I keep saying is so important, the way that Microsoft does that is this thing called the Microsoft Intelligent Security Graph. You guys have probably heard about this for years and had little understanding of why we keep harping on it and why it's such a big deal. But I think now you're really starting to see that come out. In fact, any of you who are going to Ignite in November are definitely going to see a whole lot around the Microsoft Intelligent Security Graph. Whether they talk about it or not, you're going to see it. Meaning that as I spoke about Azure ATP, which looks at all of your on-prem signals, uses cloud-based solution to apply machine learning and UEBA to all of that data and reason over it, it then can inform other systems. So let's talk a little bit about how that happens and what this actually looks like. So the way that we do zero trust in an M365 world, A3 or A5, doesn't matter, is we use conditional access through Azure Active Directory, sort of the primary component there. Remember, identity is the primary control plane. So as we look over here on the left-hand side of the screen, what we're seeing is who is the identity provider, IDP, what's the type of device that you're coming from, what's its OS like, what's its OS levels, all those types of things, right? Where are you located? Are you on the school's network? Are you even in this country? Browser applications versus client applications, kind of the conversation we were having earlier. Those are all various conditions that we want to be able to bring as signals that come in to our decision matrix, right? And so we have just an insane amount of data that's coming in, not just from the individual who's placing the request, but from all the people in your organization, all the people all over the world, essentially, that Microsoft services. And so we get a tremendous amount of intelligence through all of that signaling, and that allows us then to assign a session risk score if you have Azure Active Directory Premium Plan 2, in that case is where this comes from. That session-based risk score that we can apply to a particular login session, and as a result of that, we can start to determine what is the most effective policy that we would apply. Right now, there are lots of things that happen in a real-time evaluation without that Azure AD Plan 2. I just was mentioning that as that risk score has some tremendous value to it in and of itself. But really what we could look at is all kinds of things, whether we're in A3 or A5, it doesn't matter. I can start to look at and say, so if you log in, let's do this for the mouse. If somebody logs in using ADFS into a Windows device, and they're on a client application within the corporate network, that all comes into this engine. It says, okay, well, that risk is really low. They've authenticated, they're on-prem on a device that we manage using the application we've approved. No problem. We're going to allow them access right to Exchange Online, right? But let's say for a minute that they come in through this same thing, but their device is infected. Now, Windows Defender ATP can inform Intune, which then can inform Azure AD, and as a result, we can actually block access even to on-prem resources that have been published through this environment, right? So that's where we start to look at all this. So think about it in an education setting, especially K-12. I've had a lot of K-12s who were under attack, and the first thing that they did to stop a lot of the phishing and those types of attacks was just stop login to Azure Active Directory using a conditional access policy from outside the country. Now they can have a group in the exception policy as somebody travels or is out of the country. They can drop them into there permanently or temporarily to allow them to bypass that. But essentially what you would want to do, even in a higher ed, you could come in and say, okay, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to require MFA rather than just blocking access, right? I have a different decision that I'm going to make. Say if you're outside the United States, you know what? I don't even want to require MFA if you're on a domain joined and managed machine that is within compliance right? So it's a trusted device and it's a compliant device. So even though it's outside the United States, fine, I'll let it through. But if it doesn't meet one of those criteria, I'm going to at least challenge you for multi-factor auth. But you know what? I'm only going to do that if you're trying to hit the Exchange Online or an on-prem resource. Any of our other cloud SaaS applications, I'm going to go ahead and let you through and take that risk that you knew the username and password, right? Those are the types of things that you can get in and control, and that's how conditional access then implements zero trust. So we really take a look at this and how it looks at a deeper side. What we're really doing is looking right now today anyway at user risk and device risk primarily, and using that intelligent security graph to pull information together from tools like Azure ATP that I talked about and Cloud App Security, so that they can do user threat and risk signals that are being fed to Azure Active Directory so it can make decisions. By the same time, or at the same time, we're going to use things like Windows Hello and Azure MFA to help secure those passwords, or better yet, to start eliminating passwords altogether. From a device risk standpoint, the Defender ATP or Intune actually is informing Azure Active Directory on whether or not this device is compliant, right? So if you have some other MDM like AirWatch or Jamf or something else set up, that can actually inform the policy engine in Intune much the same way that Defender ATP does, so that we can provide that signaling into these conditional access policies so that we can then make an intelligent decision based upon that. And I apparently clicked something that decided to launch a page, so there was a hot link in there somewhere. Let's not do that again. Here we go. There we go. So the policy then is evaluated, the initial request, and change in posture is made, right? So essentially what we're looking at here is somebody logged in, we're able to then evaluate and either increase trust by requesting MFA, or maybe we say, you know what, this person's credentials had been leaked. We've seen them somewhere else on the dark web, so we can automate the remediation, force them to update their password, and require multi-factor authentication of that person. So we can enable that in near real time with them and push them through to that based upon the policies you have. Now, as a result of that, I just sort of built this whole thing out because we're kind of running low on time, and I want you to be able to see we can protect all kinds of things, not just SaaS applications, but your legacy apps on-prem as well as documents. We can literally put this Azure AD conditional access in front of something that doesn't support modern authentication like SAML or that type of stuff, and still be able to put this kind of control in front of it. So next steps for you guys, I've got all kinds of links that are inside of here, which I will make these links available inside the team shortly so that you guys can get to them. I'm not ready to post this PowerPoint yet, but I wanted you guys to see it. And then I'll put some stuff in there with the Gartner Security and Compliance Magic Quadrant so you guys can see that later. With that, I'm going to stop for just a minute and go ahead and stop the recording. And then I'm going to let you guys give me any honest feedback that you have here.